Aloha! Today I'll be presenting on tracking fear discourse at the U.S. National Conventions. Fear can be incredibly influential. It promotes our survival, but when it is used to manipulate mass groups, it can lead to devastating consequences. The new digital age has allowed mass communications to experience new levels of outreach. That being said, propaganda and misinformation is now easier than ever to spread, which further polarizes us in society. By tracking how fear is used historically, we can determine how the public discourse is being shaped through fear to benefit politicians and political parties. This research follows two main questions. First, have U.S. politicians' use of fear in speeches increased, decreased, or stayed relatively the same? And secondly, are there discourses of fear or certain patterns of fear use emerging that are crafted by politicians and political parties to manipulate public perception? In 1999, researcher David Althide's study Fear in the News, A Discourse of Control focused on the newspaper The Arizona Republic, where he found an emerging discourse of fear connecting race, gender, and social class to fear, and more specifically to crime. He also argues that fear has become a standard feature of news format, steeped in a problem frame oriented to entertainment. In other words, he deduced that news organizations create these problem frames in order to increase engagement and viewership. In a follow-up study in 2006, he analyzed 5 mainstream newspapers 18 months before and then 18 months after the 9/11 attack. He found a dramatic increase in linking terrorism to fear and victimization. Some would argue his studies are just stating the obvious, that terrorism and crime bring more talk about terrorism and crime. However, his results tell us that the numbers are in fact disproportionate. The media capitalizes off of tragedy in a way that goes past the role of simply informing the public. Looking at the 2016 election campaign, researcher Ostermuhle found Donald Trump largely gained his success through a revival of a type of rhetoric used by Puritan pilgrims long ago. He capitalized on white fears through his approach on immigration and foreign policy that Ostermuhle describes as the revival of the Jeremiad, or restoring white majority through an ethno-nativist vision of America. He says his slogan, "Make America Great Again," is the capstone of this endeavor. Trump's rhetoric attacking anti-white establishment led to the creation or revival of a new discourse prioritizing whiteness, essentially getting rid of any threat to the white majority. As one theoretical framework, this study focuses on an old theory that may seem disconnected at first. Sociologist George Simmel wrote in the early 20th century an essay called Metropolis and Mental Life, where he speaks about the philosophy of human transition from rural to urban living and the effects it has on our perception of the world around us. His main argument is that the city desensitizes us to a lot of stimuli that we would normally be attentive to. For him, this was flashing lights, loud industrial noises, and other city-like interactions. He argues that this bombardment of stimuli creates in our brain a type of protective organ that limits what stimuli can get through to the brain and be processed. It protects us from being overwhelmed by the world around us. In this, only the stimuli that can break that threshold that the protective organ creates can really reach the audience or the citygoers in his case. Connecting this philosophical concept to fear in the media, as fear increases, our brains adjust to the levels of fear being produced, which then means that producers have to drastically increase the level of fear in order to captivate the audience in a meaningful way. This would hypothetically show us that over time in these national convention speeches, fear has been increasing at an alarming rate. For methodology, 38 speeches from party national conventions were analyzed from the years 1948 to 2020, with 19 coming from each political party respectively. The year 1948 was chosen as this was the first televised national convention, so starting here would limit technological advancements that could change the format of these speeches. UC Santa Barbara's The American Presidency Project was used as a research for its database on the national convention speeches. For methods of analysis, this study focused on 2, a content analysis focusing on frequency of fear over time, and a discourse analysis to dive further into the historical context and the way topics have shifted over time through fear. For the content analysis, there will be 11 categories being coded for, but only 4 will be presented here today, mainly because the other categories were mentioned less frequently and don't have as clear of a trend. The 4 topics that remain are fear connected to domestic crime, foreign influence including immigration, the economy, and fear connected to the opponent. These speeches were chosen because they cater towards political parties' own bases. Domestic crime historically shows 3 significant spikes in usage. In 1968, the U.S. experienced the height of the civil rights movement following the death of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1996, Clinton beat Dole on the talk of crime referred largely to a bill passed the year earlier called the Brady Bill, which sought to fight crime in the United States. Similarly, in 1968, 2016, and 2020, both had massive social justice protests through the Black Lives Matter movement. Donald Trump seemed to focus on protesters using fear rhetoric, connecting protesters to anarchy, violence, and crime. Diving into the discourse itself, we can get a little more detail. For Nixon, he largely connected crime to civil unrest specifically, as well as crime and drugs in relation to breaking apart families and more specifically children. The second example given here describes the situation as filth peddlers and the narcotic peddlers who are corrupting the lives of the children of this country. Speaking of the protests, the president stated that we are torn by unprecedented racial violence, saying the president of the United States cannot travel abroad or to any major city at home without fear of hostile demonstration. So these statements use descriptive words such as filth, corruption, and connect them to children in the United States of America, which is really what we're looking at here. For Clinton in the 90s, he took a similar approach, connecting crime and drugs directly to an attack on the family. For the first example, you're not going to kill our kids anymore and turn them into murderers before they're teenagers. So this depicts a lot of what he's talking about, but also he connects domestic violence and gun obtainability to the death of spouses and children. Basically, using the words kill, killing paired with children seems very powerful and likely helped his chances of being elected. For Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020, he was at or above the frequency of crime references of any other candidate analyzed. His approach to crime had much to do with civil unrest, but a lot to do with illegal immigration. He references large numbers of illegal immigrants, 180,000 in his first example, while characterizing them as having criminal records, roaming free, ready to threaten or attack peaceful civilians. The second example is especially emotion-ridden. He describes a young woman who graduated from college with a 4.0 who was killed by a border crosser, as he describes it. And then he was let free. And then the next example we see again, 20,000 gang members, 500,000 illegal aliens, while also referencing human traffickers who prey on women and children in the exact same example. The characterization of immigrants is most astounding out of all other references to crime. The protests were also mentioned frequently, often referring to them as threatening everyday citizens. For fear connected to foreign influence, the 60s and 70s were ridden with talk of nuclear war in Vietnam specifically. Republicans largely referenced the war in relation to fear, which was relatively successful as many were elected. In the 80s, the Iran hostage situation spurred some talk, while the early 2000s was sparked by terrorism scare in 9/11, which was followed by Trump's harsh immigration rhetoric to finish off the list. For discourse analysis, we see the 60s as lots of nuclear war talk and anti-communist as well. The thermonuclear bomb that can obliterate cities is an example of this, and it is described as preposterous repercussions. So this can be seen as focusing on fear in order to promote candidates and their policies in international relations. Nixon largely focused on righting communism and freeing those countries that were controlled by it, such as Vietnam. But in 2004, the Democratic candidate had slightly more references to the terror attack than Republican Bush did. He referenced the U.S. as a nation at war with an enemy unlike any we've ever seen. And the rhetoric of this time was more focused on the Middle East as a threat than at any other time since the height of Vietnam. Trump once again seems to blow the competition out of the water. However, a lot of his references were to China stealing jobs, using words like crushing our industries and foolishly sending jobs out of the United States. A couple examples down, he says China is robbing our country blind. And looking back to Ostermuhl's study on Trump's 2016 campaign, we can see these tactics at play, where he's using rhetoric that is exclusionary to other countries, and later on he references criminal aliens and refugees in a light that uses fear to persuade the audience against involvement or assistance. The economy has rightfully so been a central topic of discussion throughout the national conventions. For those holding office, it is often what may happen if the opponent comes in, whereas the person running against the incumbent party often criticizes past policy issues, mistakes, and job losses. Due to a farming crisis in the late 70s, the 80s had inflation rates that skyrocketed. Up until 1988, Republicans seemed to have the highest frequency of economic fear-mongering, while Democrats took the lead for the following 2 decades. In the 2000s, President Obama came in focusing on keeping jobs in U.S. soil, which sparked the growth of fear in the early 2000s. Slowly, due to the housing crisis of 2009, Republicans took back the majority of fear, with Trump leading the way. In the 80s, Reagan came in while the United States was grappling with large inflation rates. He focused on what these inflation rates were doing to the rest of the country, leading to housing halts and job losses. The majority of his focus, however, is the impact this had on farmers. He painted them as a people who were suffering and trying to fight against their own government. Clinton in the 90s captured attention through looking at race and gender disparities in pay and employment, while focusing on the vast number of people who were unemployed at the time. Obama focused on raising taxes on the wealthy to help the lower classes in the lackluster efforts of the Republicans in the past 2 or so election cycles. And Trump, similar to Obama, focused on keeping jobs in the United States, but did so in a way that promoted fear. He focused on the effects outsourcing jobs would have on families and children, while referencing China as stealing jobs. In the 2020 election, also, due to massive shutdowns of businesses, which plagued much of the year due to COVID-19, he described Biden's plan of shutting down as going against science and harmful to our children and families. The connection between foreign influence, which in this case is China, economic devastation, and harm to the family seems to be the special combination in this case. This graph can give us an image of how the discourse of politics has shifted from the 1940s to the present day. For the first 40 years or so, there was little to no bashing of the opponent present. In the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we see a shift where politicians almost become their policies. Politicians capitalize on using fear to describe what this person may do if they're elected instead of themselves. While the 80s and 90s show exceedingly high numbers, it's important to differentiate the two parties in the 2000s. The rate at which Democratic candidates are attacking their opponents has very little increase historically, while Donald Trump alone constituted an increase that has no comparisons. He alone, and consistently over both cycles, used his opponent's character against them and to the advantage of the polls, setting records both times. Now, wrapping up this analysis section, here's a graph depicting the total number of instances of fear used in the period studied. This graph includes all the data from each of the 11 categories that were originally coded for. While the methodology of this study could be criticized, from this data it paints a picture of a candidate who capitalizes on fear to establish control of the masses. Trump's use of fear across the table is higher than any other candidate in our history, according to the National Convention speeches analyzed. Using him as an outlier, there's hardly a difference between the parties historically. As a ratio, with Trump included in the data set, Republicans lead by approximately 55% to 45%. But when he's taken out, the ratio tightens to 51% to 49%. Looking at the next chart, showing total averages, the trend seems concerning. Perhaps Trump's use of fear is what was needed in a country that has become desensitized to the amount of fear we were exposed to previously. Or maybe social media's politicization has played into Trump's hand, but regardless, it will be difficult to know what will happen in the future elections until we get there. In conclusion, this study seems to point towards an emerging or increasing discourse of fear over time. The frequency shown in this study shows a steady increase, which may truly be due to audiences being desensitized and requiring more stimuli to get the point across, as Zimmel might have argued. What does seem more clear is Donald Trump's exceeding all other candidates historically in nearly every aspect studied. He might have been the perfect candidate in an age where an increase of fear stimuli is needed to break the threshold of the protective organ we have created within us. I believe this study is limited because it covers fear perhaps too broadly or too ambitiously. To really break down each section will require a much narrower analysis, and along with this, tracking data every 4 years is limited, as much of the change is happening between the election cycles. The national conventions only show us a glimpse of what has happened. For further research, tracking specific topics related to fear and looking into other types of speeches may prove to be worthwhile.